Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the Lapland War of 1945, one of the most unique and tragic conflicts of World War II, where former brothers in arms turned their weapons against each other in the frozen wilderness of northern Scandinavia. As we settle in this evening, let us journey together to the remote and beautiful landscapes of Lapland, where during the final months of the Second World War, a bitter conflict unfolded between Finland and Nazi Germany. This is a story of difficult choices, strategic necessity, and the devastating costs of war in one of Europe's most pristine and unforgiving environments. To understand the Lapland War, we must first understand Finland's unique and precarious position during World War II. Finland, a nation that had gained its independence from Russia only in 1917, found itself caught between two totalitarian giants, Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east-east. The story begins in the winter of 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Finnish forces, led by Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, mounted a heroic defense that captured the world's imagination. Finnish ski troops, dressed in white camouflage, became legendary for their ability to move silently through the snow-covered forests, striking Soviet columns and disappearing like ghosts into the wilderness. The Winter War ended in March 1940 with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland was forced to cede approximately 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including the entire Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri, Finland's second largest city at the time. More than 400,000 Finns were displaced from these territories, creating a refugee crisis and a deep sense of national trauma. But the peace would not last. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland saw an opportunity to reclaim its lost territories. Finland entered what it called the Continuation War, fighting alongside Germany against their common enemy, the Soviet Union. However, Finland carefully maintained that it was fighting a separate war, not as Germany's ally, but as a co-belligerent with its own limited objectives. For 3 years, Finnish forces held defensive positions, primarily focused on defending the territories they had reclaimed. The Finnish government repeatedly resisted German pressure to participate in the siege of Leningrad or to advance beyond their pre-Winter War borders. This careful balancing act reflected Finland's desire to maintain some distance from Nazi Germany while benefiting from German military support. By 1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Red Army, having defeated the Germans at Stalingrad and Kursk, was now advancing on all fronts. In June 1944, the Soviets launched a massive offensive against Finland, seeking to knock their enemy out of the war. The Finnish forces fought with desperate determination, holding off the Soviet onslaught in brutal battles at places like Tali-Ihantala, Vuosalmi, and Ilomantsi. These battles in the summer of 1944 were among the largest fought by the Finnish army during the entire war. At Tali-Ihantala, the Finnish forces, despite being outnumbered, managed to halt the Soviet advance through a combination of skilled artillery work, tactical flexibility, and sheer determination. However, the Finnish leadership understood that continuing the war was unsustainable. Finland was exhausted after years of conflict, and the Soviet Union's vast resources meant that continued resistance would only lead to the complete occupation of the country. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were pressuring Finland to break with Germany and make peace with the Soviet Union. On September 4th, 1944, Finland announced a ceasefire with the Soviet Union. The Armistice Agreement, signed on September 19, 1944 in Moscow, contained several significant provisions. Finland would have to cede territory to the Soviet Union, including the Petsamo region in the far north, Finland's only access to the Arctic Ocean. Finland would also have to pay substantial war reparations, and, most critically for our story tonight, expel or disarm all German forces on Finnish territory. At the time of the armistice, there were approximately 200,000 German troops stationed in northern Finland and northern Norway. These forces, primarily belonging to the German 20th Mountain Army under the command of General Lothar Rendulisch, had been stationed there to protect Germany's northern flank and to secure the vital nickel mines at Petsamo. The German military presence in northern Finland had grown significantly during the Continuation War. These were not occupation forces in the traditional sense. Rather, they had been welcomed as allies in Finland's struggle against the Soviet Union. German soldiers had lived alongside Finnish civilians for years, and in many communities, relationships had developed between the Germans and the local population. The German 20th Mountain Army was a formidable force, well-equipped and experienced in Arctic warfare. These troops had adapted to the extreme conditions of the far north, learning to operate in temperatures that could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, in terrain that ranged from dense forests to barren tundra. The German forces had also built extensive infrastructure in Lapland. They had constructed roads, bridges, airfields, and fortifications. The town of Rovaniemi, the capital of Finnish Lapland, had become a major German logistics hub, with warehouses, supply depots, and communication centers. When the armistice was signed, the German command faced a strategic dilemma. General Rendulic received orders from the German High Command to conduct an organized withdrawal from Finland to northern Norway. The plan, codenamed Operation Birka, Operation Birch, called for the evacuation of all German forces and as much equipment as possible to Norway, where they would continue to defend the northern territories of the Third Reich. However, this withdrawal would take time. The distances were vast, the roads were few and often primitive, and the autumn weather in Lapland was rapidly deteriorating. The Germans needed several weeks, possibly months, to complete an orderly evacuation. The Moscow Armistice placed Finland in an extraordinarily difficult position. Article 4 of the agreement stipulated that Finland must expel all German forces from its territory, and, if the Germans did not leave within a specified time, Finland would be required to disarm them, with the assistance of Soviet forces if necessary. For the Finnish government and military leadership, this was a devastating requirement. Finnish and German soldiers had fought side by side for 3 years. Many Finnish officers and soldiers had personal relationships with their German counterparts. The idea of turning weapons against their former comrades was deeply troubling to many Finns. Moreover, there were practical considerations. The Finnish army was exhausted after years of continuous warfare. Many units had suffered heavy casualties in the summer, fighting against the Soviets. The last thing the Finnish military wanted was another campaign, especially against the well-equipped and experienced German mountain troops. There was also the question of Soviet intentions. The Finns feared that if they did not comply with the armistice terms, the Red Army might use this as a pretext to occupy Finland completely. The Soviet representative at the Allied Control Commission in Helsinki made it clear that Finland was expected to demonstrate its commitment to breaking with Germany through concrete military action. The Finnish government, led by Prime Minister Juho Kusti Paasikivi, and with the aged but still influential Marshal Mannerheim serving as president, attempted to negotiate with the Germans for a peaceful withdrawal. They hoped that the Germans would voluntarily evacuate Finnish territory quickly enough to satisfy Soviet demands without requiring actual combat. In the days following the armistice, Finnish and German representatives met to discuss the terms of the German withdrawal. These negotiations took place in an atmosphere of mutual respect, but also growing tension. General Hjalmar Siilasvuo, commander of the Finnish Third Corps, met with General Lothar Rendulic to discuss the practical arrangements for the German evacuation. Siilasvuo, a highly respected officer who had distinguished himself in the Winter War, faced the unenviable task of facilitating a peaceful withdrawal while also preparing for the possibility of conflict. The Germans presented their withdrawal plan. They would evacuate in phases, moving their forces along the limited road network from southern Lapland northward to Norway. They requested that the Finns provide them with time to complete this evacuation without interference. Rendulic emphasized that his forces would conduct an orderly withdrawal and would not destroy civilian property unnecessarily. However, there was a critical misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate ambiguity, in these discussions. The Germans viewed their withdrawal as a sovereign right. They would leave Finnish territory on their own schedule, taking with them all equipment and supplies they deemed necessary. The Finns, under Soviet pressure, needed the Germans to leave quickly and were not in a position to allow for an extended, leisurely evacuation. As days passed, it became increasingly clear that the German withdrawal was proceeding more slowly than the Soviets expected. The Soviet representatives at the Allied Control Commission began to press the Finnish government more insistently, demanding visible proof that Finland was actively expelling the Germans. The first hostile encounters between Finnish and German forces occurred in mid-September 1944, even before the armistice had been formally signed. Finnish naval vessels attempted to enforce a blockade of German shipping in the Gulf of Bothnia, leading to several minor skirmishes. On land, tensions escalated when Finnish forces moved to secure key positions in accordance with the armistice terms. On September 15, 1944, the Finnish Navy occupied the island of Suursaari in the Gulf of Finland. German forces had maintained a presence on the island, and while the handover was initially peaceful, it marked the beginning of the territorial transition. The situation deteriorated further when Finnish forces moved to secure the port of Tornio on the Swedish border. The port was strategically important, as it could allow Finnish forces to cut off the southern escape routes for German forces in northern Finland. On September 30, 1944, Finnish forces began an amphibious operation to take control of Tornio. The operation took the Germans by surprise. Finnish troops, transported by sea from southern Finland, landed at Tornio and quickly secured key positions in the town. However, German forces in the area, belonging to the 163rd Infantry Division, mounted a determined resistance. What followed was intense urban combat, with Finnish and German soldiers fighting house to house in a town where, just days before, they had coexisted peacefully. The Battle of Tornio was fierce and confused. Buildings that had housed German soldiers now became fortresses from which they fought. Finnish troops, many of whom were veterans of years of combat, pressed forward despite taking casualties. The fighting was particularly bitter because both sides knew each other. These were not anonymous enemies, but former allies who now found themselves forced into combat. Simultaneously with the landing at Tornio, Finnish forces launched an attack at Kemi, just south of Tornio. The Battle of Kemi lasted from October 1st to October 8th, 1944. German forces defended the town stubbornly, knowing that if the Finns secured both Tornio and Kemi, a major portion of the German forces further north would be cut off from their withdrawal routes. The attacks at Tornio and Kemi fundamentally changed the nature of the German withdrawal. What had been planned as an orderly evacuation now became a fighting retreat. General Rendulic, responding to what he saw as Finnish betrayal, ordered his forces to conduct a scorched earth policy as they withdrew northward. This decision would have devastating consequences for Finnish Lapland. Rendulic justified the policy on military grounds. Destroying infrastructure would slow any Finnish pursuit and deny resources to Soviet forces that might advance into the region. However, the scope of the destruction went far beyond military necessity and included the systematic burning of civilian homes, businesses, and entire towns. The German forces began their withdrawal in earnest in October 1944. As they pulled back, they destroyed bridges, mined roads, and burned everything that might be of use to an advancing army. Tragically, this included not just military facilities, but also civilian infrastructure that the Germans had helped build during their years in Lapland. Finnish forces, now openly in conflict with their former allies, pursued the withdrawing Germans. However, the Finnish advance was hampered by several factors. The destruction of infrastructure slowed movement, the autumn weather was deteriorating rapidly, and the Finnish troops, after years of war, were simply tired. As October progressed, the pattern of the Lapland War became established. German forces would establish defensive positions, hold them long enough to allow their supply columns to move northward, and then withdraw to the next defensive line. Finnish forces would attack these positions, often after considerable preparation, and the Germans would fall back before being encircled. The town of Rovaniemi became the focal point of one of the war's most tragic episodes. Rovaniemi was the capital of Finnish Lapland, a town of wooden buildings that had grown significantly during the war years due to the German presence. As German forces prepared to evacuate Rovaniemi in October 1944, they received orders to destroy the town's infrastructure. On October 13, 1944, German troops began systematically setting fire to Rovaniemi. Building after building was set ablaze. The town's wooden structures burned quickly, and soon much of Rovaniemi was engulfed in the flames. The destruction was nearly total, Approximately 90% of the town's buildings were destroyed. Only a few stone structures, including the library and the courthouse, survived the conflagration. The destruction of Rovaniemi became symbolic of the tragedy of the Lapland War. Here was a town that had hosted German soldiers for years, where German and Finnish children had played together, where friendships had formed, now reduced to ashes by German hands. The images of Rovaniemi burning would become seared into Finnish national memory. Finnish forces entered the ruins of Rovaniemi on October 16, 1944, just 3 days after the destruction began. They found a city of charred timbers and smoking rubble. The civilian population, having been evacuated before the burning, had lost their homes and livelihoods. As the Lapland War progressed into November and December, the weather became an enemy as formidable as any human opponent. The temperature dropped steadily, and snow began to fall heavily. Daylight hours decreased dramatically. In the far north, the sun would not rise at all during the depth of winter, creating a period of perpetual twilight known as the polar night. Both Finnish and German soldiers were experienced in winter warfare, but the conditions in Lapland tested even the hardiest troops. Soldiers had to deal with extreme cold that could cause frostbite in minutes if proper precautions weren't taken. Equipment froze and became unreliable. Vehicles required constant maintenance to keep running in the cold. Supply lines, always difficult in the remote north, became even more challenging to maintain. The soldiers on both sides endured extraordinary hardships. They slept in improvised shelters or tents in temperatures well below freezing. Hot food was a luxury that often couldn't be provided due to the tactical situation. Frostbite casualties began to mount on both sides, sometimes exceeding casualties from combat. Despite these conditions, the fighting continued. Finnish forces attacked German positions at Muonio, Enontekiö, and other towns along the withdrawal route. The Germans defended each position skillfully, inflicting casualties on the Finns before withdrawing. It was a grinding, exhausting campaign with little glory for either side. The Lapland War was not a large conflict by World War II standards, but for those involved, it was intensely personal and tragic. Finnish and German soldiers who had shared meals and fought together against a common enemy now found themselves in combat against each other. There are numerous accounts from veterans on both sides of the confusion and sorrow they felt. Finnish soldiers described the difficulty of advancing toward German positions, knowing that they might be facing soldiers they had known personally. German soldiers spoke of their bewilderment at being forced to fight against the Finns, whom they had considered friends and allies. The casualties on both sides reflected the intensity of the fighting, even if the scale was limited compared to other theaters of World War II. Finnish forces suffered approximately 1,000 killed and 3,000 wounded during the Lapland War. German casualties were slightly higher, with around 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded. Many additional soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite and other cold-related injuries. For the civilian population of Lapland, the war was catastrophic. Beyond the destruction of Rovaniemi, numerous other towns and villages were burned by the retreating Germans. Approximately 100,000 people in Lapland were made homeless by the destruction. These civilians faced the prospect of winter in the Arctic without shelter, a potentially deadly situation. The Finnish government organized massive evacuation efforts, moving civilians south to areas untouched by the fighting. Trains, trucks, and even reindeer were used to transport refugees. Local communities throughout Finland opened their homes to the displaced Laplanders, providing shelter through the winter months. The destruction also included vital infrastructure. The Germans destroyed approximately 95% of the buildings in Lapland's towns, along with countless farms and rural homes. They burned bridges, destroyed roads, and even took or killed the livestock. The region's economy, which had been based on reindeer herding, forestry, and mining, was devastated. As 1944 turned to 1945, the Lapland War entered its most difficult phase. The winter was fully established now, with temperatures regularly dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. The landscape was buried under deep snow, and the few roads that existed were difficult to keep open. German forces had now withdrawn into the far northern areas of Finland and were preparing to cross into Norway. The main German defensive line ran through the Kilpisjärvi region in the extreme northwest corner of Finland, where Finland meets both Norway and Sweden. Finnish forces continued their pursuit, but the pace had slowed considerably. The logistics of maintaining an army in such remote areas during winter were daunting. Everything needed to be brought forward over long supply lines that were vulnerable to weather and the German delaying actions. One of the last significant battles of the war occurred at Palojoensuu in January 1945. Finnish forces attacked German positions in bitter cold, fighting through snow and ice. The Germans defended stubbornly, but eventually withdrew across the border into Norway, leaving their Finnish positions behind. The fighting in these final months took on a surreal quality. Units would sometimes be isolated for days or weeks, cut off from higher command by communication difficulties and weather. Small patrol actions and skirmishes occurred in a landscape of snow and darkness. Both sides suffered more from the cold than from enemy action. By late February 1945, most German forces had withdrawn from Finnish territory into Norway. However, small German units and stragglers remained, and Finnish forces continued operations to clear the remaining German presence. Finnish forces actually crossed into Norway in pursuit of the Germans, operating in the Finnmark region of northern Norway. This created an unusual situation where Finnish troops were fighting on Norwegian soil against German forces that were defending what was, nominally, Norwegian territory occupied by Germany. The Norwegian resistance fighters, who had been waging a guerrilla campaign against the German occupation, found themselves with an unexpected ally in the Finnish forces. However, the relationship was complicated by Norway's status as a German-occupied country, and Finland's ambiguous position as a former German co-belligerent now fighting against Germany. The fighting in Norway continued sporadically through March and into April 1945. These were small-scale actions, often involving company or battalion-sized units, rather than the larger battles of the earlier phases of the war. By this time, the end of World War II was clearly approaching, and both sides knew that the conflict in the far north was becoming irrelevant to the broader strategic picture. As April 1945 arrived, the world was watching the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. American and British forces were advancing deep into Germany from the west, and the Third Reich's days were numbered. In the far north, the Lapland War had become almost forgotten by the wider world. The last exchanges of fire between Finnish and German forces occurred in late April 1945. On April 25, 1945, Finnish forces officially ended their military operations against German forces. 2 weeks later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II in Europe. The Lapland War had lasted approximately 7 months, from September 1944 to April 1945. In that time, it had transformed from a hoped-for peaceful transition to an active military conflict that left deep scars on the landscape and psyche of northern Finland. When the war finally ended, the people of Lapland faced the enormous task of rebuilding their lives and communities. The destruction had been so complete in many areas that entire towns needed to be reconstructed from scratch. Rovaniemi became the symbol of this reconstruction. The town was rebuilt with help from the entire nation, with the Finnish government providing significant resources for reconstruction. The renowned architect Alvar Aalto was commissioned to design the new city center, creating a plan that would make Rovaniemi a modern, functional city. The rebuilding of Rovaniemi took many years, but it eventually emerged as a thriving regional capital. Throughout Lapland, communities came together to rebuild. Families who had lost everything received assistance from both the government and from fellow Finns in the south. The work was hard and slow, complicated by the harsh climate and the remote location. However, the people of Lapland were resilient and determined to restore their homeland. The reconstruction wasn't just physical. The region's economy had to be rebuilt as well. The reindeer herds, which were central to the Sami people's way of life and to Lapland's economy, had been severely depleted. Forests had been damaged by the fighting and fires. The mining operations at Petsamo, which had been so important, were now in Soviet hands following the territorial cessions in the Armistice Agreement. The Lapland War left psychological scars that took generations to heal. For many Finnish veterans, the conflict represented a betrayal of comradeship and a bitter necessity forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. Having fought alongside the Germans against the Soviet Union for 3 years, They now had to take up arms against their former allies to satisfy Soviet demands and preserve Finnish independence. Many German soldiers who fought in Lapland felt similarly betrayed. They believed they had come to Finland's aid in its struggle against Soviet aggression, and they found it difficult to understand why the Finns had turned against them. The scorched earth policy, while ordered from above, was carried out by soldiers who felt anger and disappointment at what they saw as Finnish treachery. The relationship between Finland and Germany after the war was complicated by the Lapland War. In the immediate post-war years, as Finland struggled under the burden of war reparations to the Soviet Union and worked to maintain its independence in the new political reality of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, there was little time for reflection on the German relationship. However, as the decades passed and wounds began to heal, both Finns and Germans came to recognize the tragedy of the Lapland War as a product of the impossible situation created by World War II. Veterans from both sides eventually met in reconciliation ceremonies, acknowledging the suffering on both sides and the fact that they had been pawns in a larger geopolitical game. Historians have long debated whether the Lapland War was truly necessary. Some argue that Finland had no choice. The Moscow Armistice required the expulsion or disarmament of German forces, and failure to comply would have given the Soviet Union a pretext for full occupation of Finland. From this perspective, the Lapland War, tragic as it was, helped preserve Finnish independence. Others contend that a more gradual approach could have been taken, allowing the Germans more time to withdraw peacefully. They point out that the Soviet Union, while pressuring Finland, was primarily focused on defeating Germany in the main theaters of war, and might have been more patient if Finland had demonstrated good faith in facilitating a German withdrawal. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions. The Finnish government was under immense pressure from the Soviet Union and the Allied Control Commission to demonstrate its break with Germany. At the same time, the Germans were genuinely planning to withdraw and had begun evacuations before the fighting started. The clash at Tornio, whether it was a calculated Finnish provocation or a defensive German response, set in motion a chain of events that led to wider conflict. General Rendulic's decision to implement a scorched earth policy remains particularly controversial. While he argued it was militarily justified, the scale of destruction visited upon Finnish civilian communities went beyond what military necessity would dictate. The burning of Rovaniemi and other towns served no real military purpose and caused enormous suffering to the Finnish population. In Finnish historical consciousness, the Lapland War occupies a unique and somewhat uncomfortable position. Unlike the Winter War, which is remembered as a heroic defense against overwhelming odds, or the Continuation War, which is recognized as a complex but necessary struggle to reclaim lost territory, the Lapland War is remembered more with sadness than pride. The war represents the final chapter of Finland's long and difficult experience of World War II. After years of conflict, sacrifice, and uncertainty, the Finnish people wanted only peace. Having to fight yet another campaign, this time against former allies, in the devastated landscape of the North, brought home the full cost and complexity of Finland's wartime experience. The Lapland War also represents Finland's difficult transition from its awkward co-belligerency with Nazi Germany to its post-war position as a neutral nation, trying to maintain good relations with both East and West. The war was, in a sense, the price Finland paid for its earlier alignment with Germany, and it helped demonstrate to the Soviet Union and the Western Allies that Finland was genuinely breaking with its Nazi past. For the people of Lapland specifically, the war is remembered as a regional tragedy. The physical scars healed over time, as towns were rebuilt and forests regrew, but the memory of that winter when nearly everything was destroyed remained powerful. Many families lost not just their homes, but family photographs, heirlooms, and other irreplaceable connections to their past. Outside of Finland and Germany, the Lapland War is largely unknown. In the grand narrative of World War II, with its massive battles involving millions of soldiers and its world historical consequences, a conflict involving fewer than 100,000 combatants in the remote Arctic seems almost insignificant. However, the Lapland War represents an important chapter in the history of World War II's end. It demonstrates the complex political and military situations that arose as the war wound down, with former allies becoming enemies and strange new partnerships forming. It shows how great power politics, particularly Soviet pressure on Finland, could force small nations into actions they would have preferred to avoid. The war also stands as an example of how the end of World War II was not a clean, simple process, but rather a messy, complicated period during which many smaller conflicts and transitions occurred. While the world's attention was focused on the Battle of Berlin and the final defeat of Germany, the soldiers fighting in the snow and darkness of Lapland were experiencing their own intense drama of war and survival. For the German soldiers who fought in the Lapland War, the conflict represented one more bitter chapter in the final collapse of the Third Reich. These were experienced soldiers, many of whom had fought on the Eastern Front and knew firsthand the brutality of modern warfare. They had come to respect the Finnish soldiers as brave and capable fighters, and the turn to hostilities was deeply troubling to many. The German mountain troops in particular had developed expertise in Arctic warfare during their years in the north. They were well equipped with specialized clothing, equipment, and vehicles designed for extreme cold. Despite the harsh conditions, they conducted their retreat with professional competence, establishing defensive positions, conducting fighting withdrawals, and maintaining unit cohesion even under difficult circumstances. However, the retreat was also marked by the scorched earth policy that left such devastation in its wake. Many German soldiers participated reluctantly in the destruction, following orders but uncomfortable with burning the homes of civilians who had previously been friendly to them. Some German veterans later expressed regret about the destruction, acknowledging that it went beyond military necessity. The withdrawal through Lapland and into Norway was extraordinarily difficult. The German columns had to move hundreds of kilometers over poor roads and terrible weather, all while being pursued by Finnish forces. Vehicles broke down in the cold, supplies ran short, and soldiers suffered from exposure. It was a harsh ending to Germany's presence in the far north, and many soldiers who survived the Lapland War would later recall it as one of their most difficult experiences of the entire war. The Soviet Union's role in the Lapland War, while indirect, was crucial. The Moscow Armistice had placed the requirement on Finland to expel German forces, and Soviet representatives in Helsinki made it clear that they expected Finland to comply promptly and vigorously. The Allied Control Commission, dominated by the Soviets, monitored Finnish actions closely. They demanded regular reports on Finnish military operations against the Germans and expressed dissatisfaction when they felt Finnish efforts were insufficient. This pressure was the driving force behind many of Finland's military decisions during the war. Interestingly, the Soviet Union did not directly participate in the Lapland War with ground forces, though they had retained the right to do so under the armistice terms. Soviet aircraft did conduct some operations in support of Finnish forces, and Soviet advisors were present with Finnish units, but the actual fighting was left to the Finns. This arrangement suited both parties. For the Soviets, having the Finns do the fighting against the Germans demonstrated Finnish commitment to breaking with Nazi Germany without requiring the Soviet Union to extend its own supply lines into remote Lapland. For the Finns, the absence of Soviet ground forces meant that they could conduct operations without Soviet soldiers on Finnish soil, preserving at least a degree of sovereignty. However, Finnish commanders always had to be mindful of Soviet observation and judgment. They needed to fight aggressively enough to satisfy Soviet demands, but also had to be careful not to take excessive casualties or exhaust their forces, as they knew they would need to maintain a credible military for the uncertain post-war period. The Lapland War was unique in several respects when compared to other military operations during World War II. First, it was one of the few instances where former allies fought each other in a formal military campaign. While there were other cases of former partners falling out, such as the Italian campaign after Italy's surrender, few involved the sustained military operations of the Lapland War. Second, the environmental conditions were extraordinary. While other forces fought in winter conditions on the Eastern Front, the combination of extreme Arctic cold, darkness, and remoteness made the Lapland War exceptional. Soldiers fought in temperatures that would have halted operations in most other theaters, in terrain that offered little shelter or concealment. Third, the scale and intensity were oddly moderate. Neither side sought the complete destruction of the other. The Finns wanted the Germans to leave Finnish territory, which the Germans were already planning to do. The Germans wanted to conduct an orderly retreat without being harassed, which the Finns would have preferred to allow, if not for Soviet pressure. The result was a conflict in which both sides fought with skill and courage, but also with a certain restraint born of their previous relationship and mutual respect. The physical geography of Lapland played a major role in shaping the course of the war. The region is characterized by vast distances, sparse population, and limited infrastructure. There were few roads, and those that existed were often primitive and easily blocked or destroyed. The landscape itself varied considerably across the region. In the south, around Rovaniemi and Kemi, there were more developed areas with actual towns and better road networks. As one moved north, however, the landscape became increasingly wild and remote. Dense forests gave way to open tundra in the far north, with scattered lakes, rivers, and the hills breaking up the terrain. This geography favored the defender. German forces could establish positions along the limited road network, forcing the Finns to attack frontally or attempt difficult flanking maneuvers through roadless wilderness. The destruction of bridges was particularly effective in slowing Finnish advances, as the rivers, even when frozen, posed significant obstacles. The weather added another dimension to the terrain challenge. Heavy snow could make movement off established paths nearly impossible. Blizzards could ground aircraft and make artillery observation difficult. The limited daylight hours, and in the far north, the complete darkness of the polar night, restricted the hours available for military operations. Despite these challenges, both sides demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Finnish troops, many of whom were from Lapland or northern Finland, were intimately familiar with the terrain and conditions. They used skis and sleds for mobility, operated in small, flexible units, and knew how to survive and fight in the extreme environment. The military technology and tactics used in the Lapland War had to be adapted to the unique conditions. Standard military equipment often required modification to function reliably in the extreme cold. Weapons had to be constantly maintained to prevent freezing. Lubricants that worked in temperate climates would freeze solid in Arctic conditions, rendering weapons useless. Soldiers learned to use minimal lubrication and to keep their weapons covered and protected from ice and snow when not in use. Vehicles were another challenge. Engines had to be kept running or regularly started to prevent them from freezing solid. Special cold weather lubricants and antifreeze were essential. Even with these precautions, mechanical failures were common. Both sides made extensive use of sleds and animal transport to supplement or replace vehicles. Artillery, a crucial weapon in both sides' arsenal, faced particular difficulties. The extreme cold affected propellant performance, requiring adjustments to firing calculations. The frozen ground made it harder to dig proper emplacements. Snow and ice could damage equipment and obscure observation. Communication was another challenge. Radio equipment was vulnerable to cold and had to be carefully maintained. The terrain and atmospheric conditions sometimes interfered with radio communications, forcing units to rely on messengers, including ski patrols, to maintain contact. Tactically, both sides adapted to the conditions by emphasizing small unit operations, mobility, and flexibility. The vast distances and limited road network made it difficult to concentrate large forces. Instead, companies and battalions operated with considerable independence, adapting their actions to the local situation. The medical services on both sides faced enormous challenges during the Lapland War. Treating wounded soldiers in extreme cold, often far from medical facilities, required improvisation and extraordinary dedication from medical personnel. Frostbite was as serious a concern as combat injuries. Soldiers who were wounded and couldn't move were at extreme risk of freezing to death before they could be evacuated. Medical personnel had to treat not only gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, but also the effects of exposure to extreme cold. Evacuation of casualties was particularly difficult. The limited road network and challenging weather made it hard to get wounded soldiers to field hospitals quickly. Ambulances and other vehicles struggled with the conditions. In some cases, wounded soldiers had to be evacuated by sled or even by ski patrol, a painful and dangerous process. Field hospitals had to operate in the harsh conditions, often in tents or improvised structures that provided minimal protection from the cold. Medical supplies could freeze, surgical instruments had to be carefully maintained, and simply keeping patients warm enough to survive was a constant challenge. Despite these difficulties, medical personnel on both sides performed admirably. Doctors, nurses, and medics worked under extremely difficult conditions to save lives and alleviate suffering. Many soldiers who would have died in other circumstances survived thanks to the dedication and skill of the medical staff. For civilians in Lapland, the war was a catastrophic disruption of normal life. Many had already endured years of wartime restrictions and uncertainty. Now they faced the destruction of their homes and communities and displacement in the middle of winter. The evacuation of civilians from combat zones was a massive undertaking. The Finnish government organized trains, trucks, and other transport to move people south to safer areas. Families had to leave behind most of their possessions, taking only what they could carry. Many didn't know when or if they would be able to return. The journey south was often difficult and frightening. Roads were damaged or destroyed, trains were crowded and cold, and the weather was harsh. Families with small children faced particular challenges. The elderly and infirm struggled with the physical demands of evacuation. Those who reached safety in southern Finland found communities that, while themselves struggling with wartime shortages, did their best to welcome and help the refugees. Finnish people across the country opened their homes, shared their resources, and provided what comfort they could to the displaced Laplanders. For the Sami people, the indigenous population of Lapland, the war was particularly disruptive. Many Sami lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle based on reindeer herding, moving seasonally with their herds. The war disrupted these patterns. Reindeer were lost to the fighting and destruction, and traditional grazing areas were rendered unusable by mines and unexploded ordnance. The destruction of reindeer herds was not just an economic loss, but also a cultural one. Reindeer herding was central to Sami identity and way of life. The recovery of the herds after the war took many years and required significant support from the Finnish government and international organizations. Despite the bitterness of the fighting and the scorched earth policy implemented by the retreating Germans, the Lapland War was largely conducted in accordance with the laws of war as they existed at the time. There were few reports of atrocities or deliberate targeting of civilians by either side. The destruction of civilian property by the Germans, while devastating, was presented as a military necessity, denying resources to pursuing forces, rather than as punishment of civilians. While this distinction might have seemed meaningless to the Finns who lost their homes, it did mean that civilians themselves were generally not harmed directly. Prisoners of war on both sides were generally treated correctly according to the Geneva Conventions. Both Finnish and German forces had experience with the conventions and largely adhered to them. Wounded soldiers were treated humanely, and captured soldiers were provided with food, shelter, and medical care as far as was possible given the difficult conditions. This relatively humane conduct stands in sharp contrast to the brutal warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front, where the German-Soviet conflict was marked by widespread atrocities, deliberate targeting of civilians, and horrific treatment of prisoners of war. The fact that Finnish and German soldiers could maintain professional military conduct even while fighting each other speaks to the different nature of the relationship between these nations compared to the genocidal conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. As April 1945 drew to a close, the Lapland War came to an end. Finnish forces had accomplished their mission. German forces had been expelled from Finnish territory. The cost had been high, both in casualties and in the destruction of Lapland, but Finland had satisfied the requirements of the Moscow Armistice. The last German soldiers crossed from Finland into Norway in late April. Behind them, they left a devastated landscape, thousands of displaced civilians, and the bitter memories of a conflict that should never have been necessary. Ahead of them lay an uncertain future as the Third Reich collapsed around them. Finnish soldiers, exhausted after years of nearly continuous warfare, could finally stand down. They had fought in the Winter War, the Continuation War, and now the Lapland War. They had faced the Soviet Union, fought alongside Germany, and then against Germany. Now, finally, the fighting was over. For Finland as a nation, the end of the Lapland War marked the true end of World War II. The country had survived, maintaining its independence despite being caught between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The price had been enormous. territorial losses, war reparations, thousands of dead, and the destruction of Lapland, but Finland had survived as an independent nation. In the decades that followed, Finland would chart a careful course during the Cold War, maintaining its independence while accommodating Soviet security concerns in a policy that came to be known as Finlandization. The experience of World War II, including the difficult choices made during the Lapland War, shaped Finnish foreign policy for generations. Today, more than 80 years after the Lapland War, its legacy continues to resonate in Finland and particularly in Lapland. The rebuilt towns and cities of the north stand as testament to the resilience of the Finnish people. Rovaniemi, risen from its ashes, has become a thriving city and the capital of Finnish Lapland, though the scars of its destruction are still visible if you know where to look. Memorials throughout Lapland commemorate both the war and the reconstruction that followed. These memorials honor not just the soldiers who fought, but also the civilians who lost everything and rebuilt their lives. They serve as reminders of the costs of war and the importance of peace. The Lapland War offers several important lessons. First, it demonstrates the tragic consequences that can arise when small nations are caught between great powers. Finland's situation in 1944, forced to fight its former ally to satisfy its new overlord, was a product of geopolitical forces beyond its control. Second, it shows the importance of difficult decisions in preserving national independence. The Finnish government's choice to comply with Soviet demands and expel German forces, even at the cost of fighting a war against former allies, helped preserve Finnish sovereignty. A different choice might have resulted in full Soviet occupation. Third, it illustrates the human capacity for both destruction and reconstruction. The systematic burning of Lapland was a tragedy, but the subsequent rebuilding demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Finnish people. Finally, the Lapland War reminds us that even in the bitter circumstances of war between former allies, it is possible to maintain some degree of humanity and adherence to the laws of war. The relatively clean conduct of the conflict, despite its bitterness, stands as a positive example. In the years since the war, there have been efforts at reconciliation between Finnish and German veterans of the Lapland War. These meetings, often emotional and difficult, allowed former enemies to share their experiences and find understanding. Many veterans on both sides expressed similar feelings, that they had been caught up in events beyond their control, forced into a conflict neither side wanted. German soldiers spoke of their confusion and pain at fighting against people they had considered friends. Finnish soldiers described the difficulty of turning weapons against former comrades. These reconciliation efforts have helped heal some of the wounds left by the war. They have also provided valuable historical insights, as veterans from both sides shared their perspectives and memories, helping historians understand the conflict more fully. Today, Finland and Germany enjoy friendly relations, and the Lapland War is remembered as a tragic episode in a troubled past, rather than as a source of continuing enmity. This reconciliation is part of the broader European healing after World War II, but it has special poignancy given the unique circumstances of the Lapland War. As we come to the end of our journey tonight through the story of the Lapland War, we can reflect on this unique and tragic conflict. It was not one of the great battles of World War II, no massive tank engagements, no decisive turning points that changed the course of history. Instead, it was a smaller, bitter conflict fought in harsh conditions in a remote part of Europe. Yet, the Lapland War matters. It matters to the people of Lapland, who lost their homes and rebuilt their lives. It matters to the veterans on both sides, who carried the memories of that winter for the rest of their lives. It matters to Finland as a nation, as it represents the final chapter of the country's difficult World War II experience. The war demonstrates the complex moral landscape of the end of World War II, the simple narrative of good versus evil that characterizes much of our understanding of that conflict becomes more complicated when we examine cases like the Lapland War, where former allies became enemies not out of fundamental disagreement, but because of the pressure of geopolitical forces. The soldiers who fought in the snow and darkness of Lapland were doing their duty as they understood it. Finnish soldiers were following their government's orders and trying to preserve their nation's independence. German soldiers were conducting an ordered retreat while protecting their comrades. Both sides showed courage, professionalism, and resilience in extraordinarily difficult conditions. The destruction of Lapland was a tragedy, but it led to rebuilding and renewal. The towns and cities that rose from the ashes became in many ways better than what had been lost. The people who suffered through that terrible winter of 1944 to 45 went on to build successful lives and communities. As we remember the Lapland War tonight, we honor those who fought, those who survived, and those who rebuilt. Their story, though often forgotten in the larger narrative of World War II, deserves to be told and remembered. It is a story of hardship and loss, but also of resilience and hope. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, people can endure, rebuild, and move forward. The forests have regrown over the battlefields of Lapland. The rivers flow as they always have. The northern lights still dance in the Arctic sky. The physical scars of the Lapland War have largely healed, though memories remain. In the peace and quiet of a winter night in modern Lapland, it can be hard to imagine the conflict that once raged across this beautiful landscape. But we remember, and in remembering, we honor those who experienced that difficult time. We learn from their experiences, we appreciate the peace we now enjoy, and we resolve to work for a world where such conflicts need never happen again. And so, tonight, as we conclude our story of the Lapland War, let us take a moment to reflect on the costs of war, the value of peace, and the resilience of the human spirit. Let us remember that even in the coldest, darkest winter, there is always the promise of spring and renewal. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through a forgotten chapter of World War II. May the memory of those who suffered in the Lapland War inspire us to cherish peace and work for understanding between all peoples. Good night.